Okay, so recording's now started. Thanks very much for joining us, everybody. I hope you had a great weekend. We're joined today for a second session by Sally Palethorpe. For those who missed the first session, Sally's a real expert when it comes to change facilitation with business. We worked with Sally on the Area 10 asset support contract, and Sally led our transformational change program. Today she's going to talk about the understanding how the change curve and the way we manage change can help us to deliver lean improvement projects. So I'm not going to talk for much longer. I'm just going to hand you over to Sally. There's a couple of polls throughout the session, so bear with me as I do the questions. And over to you, Sally.
Thank you very much, Stuart. So as Stuart said, welcome to my second Lunch and Learn session, and thanks as always for Stuart for arranging the sessions and also being the technical wizard when I don't know how to toggle between screens even. So today I'm going to be talking about change management and why you should bother with change when you're working on lean or any other transformation type activity. As Stuart said, topic close to my heart. I've been working in the field of change for about 20 years now. And I passionately believe if more people understood some of these basic tools and techniques, then more changes would be successful. So the objectives are to build understanding across the community of what might be missed when you're implementing change. So we've fondly called that the other stuff. And it came about during a session that I ran for Stuart a couple of years ago, actually, for Highways England as well. I want to share a selection of practical change management tips and techniques, and then also have an opportunity to reflect on what could be modified to ensure sustained results from a lean perspective. So for those of you that listened to my first one, welcome back, and I apologise, there's 2 slides that are repeated. So for those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Sally. I am an engineer by qualification. I was an apprentice fitter at the age of 16. Then did a mechanical engineering degree, and then moved into business consultancy about 25 years ago now. Working across a range of different sectors, both private and public, doing a lot of work in the highway sector, rail sector, and also for the defence sector. I was business improvement director for one of the divisions of Thales for a couple of years, again looking after quality, business improvement and process improvement. And I set up my Inspired Partners 16 years ago now. And then I also act as a guest lecturer for the University of Bath, which I've been doing, I think, for 8 years now, lecturing on change management for their engineering students and also the chemical engineering sector. So today, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to what we mean by change. I'm going to show you some research and then talk through the 6 components of the other stuff. So give you an overview of each and some practical tips and techniques with a bit of reflection and Q&A. The intention is to have 10-15 minutes of Q&A at the end. So please do ask your questions. And to be quite honest, if they're just related to change and you just got something that you want to ask me, then that's fine as well. So this is the second slide that's repeat, but I think it's worth putting in there. What do we mean by change? So it's movement from a current state to another desired state. And interestingly, with the pandemic, is it a desired state or is it a state that we need to move to because it's where society needs us to transition to? But it's movement from one place to another place. And an entity can be in a whole organisation, it can be a team, or it can be an individual. And you can plan it in advance, or you can have it as a response to an internal and external shift. It can impact lots of different areas across the organisation. And it can be transformational or incremental. And I think that goes for lean projects as well. Some of them are transformational and some of them are incremental. But it is about letting go of the old ways. And sometimes, because on the change curve, when we talked about people, sometimes letting go of the old ways, even if you know that the new way is a good way, can be quite uncomfortable for people. And change is around us all the time, and we can't deliver change in a vacuum. So you need to take into consideration the business goals, the financial targets, and also the culture that you're looking to change, which is why sometimes when people move between sectors, some of the cultural differences are there. And we need to just tweak and tailor our changes to ensure that they align appropriately. So before I leap into some more theory, I've got a poll for you, which Stuart will suitably put up. So I just wanted to gauge from the audience, what do you think the typical failure rate is for organisational change projects? And organisational change projects is typically when you're looking to change something across the whole organisation rather than just in a small team. So I'll just let Stuart put that up for a minute.
Should be up on screen now. I'm frantically typing away.
Oh no, sorry, Stuart.
Got a few more people just to answer. Brayley's asked, Sally, what about sort of 0 to 100?
Yeah, the clue is in this. It's a multiple choice, multiple guess question. One of those is right, is more correct than the others.
So we're down to our last couple now. So we're very heavily weighted to 60 to 70%. 21 people have said 60 to 70%.
Okay, and that is sadly the correct answer. So although sort of I'll call it a science, but it's not really, but the science of change management has been around for over 50 years. I said I've been working in it for 20 plus years. Those statistics haven't really shifted in the years that I've been working in it. And I don't think it's because change is impossible to do. I think it's because people don't have the right skill set and the right knowledge. So and there's a couple of examples here. So one's from the Harvard Business Review, which is where the 67% comes from. And then McKinsey and Company say just 26% of respondents say transformations they've been most familiar with have been completely successful. I always caveat this because that doesn't mean that change isn't happening. It just means that we're not delivering the optimum changes. So when we first set out and we decide what change we want to make or what the transformation is, we have some goals and objectives. And this is saying that those goals and objectives aren't fully met. So, and the tool that I'm going to talk about will give you some ideas of how you can beat the odds. So we've come up with the other stuff. It's a simple tool that we use with clients to diagnose the areas that they need to address. So, and it's the areas that are often overlooked. So whenever I go in and work with companies, these are the areas that people typically haven't put in place. They've often put in place all the technical aspects, but maybe not some of the people aspects. But there's also some basic parts that we need to look at as well, which would come under project management. But before we sort of said to the world, we've got this tool that we can use with you, we wanted to validate this with by looking through research. And we looked through about 30 or 40 papers from the last 10 years. I'm not going to bore you with all of the details. If anyone's interested, I've got a couple of papers around this that I can share and just let me know at the end. But I'll just go through the key things that we found. So things that came out with lack of planning, vague and unclear outcomes. Interestingly, having clear outcomes was the topic of one of the talks last week. Management commitment, and making certain you've got that from the outset. Visible and sustained sponsorship, having enough resources dedicated to the change, it not being something that people do in their spare time. Making certain you've got communications across all the different organisation levels, knowing about your key stakeholders, so who the supporters and resistors are, acknowledging that people have individual perspectives, And then understanding how employees perceive the change, because we all perceive things differently. And then this talks about human behaviour and how do you consider that? So how do you think about the people side of things? And then continually monitor the changes that you're making, and then making certain that it's fully institutionalised. So those different areas came out into the other stuff. I'm sharing this with you because I've given you enough information in these slides that if you wanted to do a quick and dirty diagnostic for yourself, I think you could. So what we do for there's 6 areas, 5 topics or 5 statements per area. And we have in a workshop situation, either with the change team or the people that are being, the change is being done with, get to answer each of those statements to say, yes, we're doing that, we're partly doing that, are we doing it more or less well, and no, we're not doing that at all. So it gives you a chance to say which are the areas that we need to work with. The statements are longer than those written in the slides, but at least by having the slides, you've sort of got some ideas of what we're looking to investigate. So the first one is B for basics. So, and we need to think about the basics of how we do projects. And this is more relating to project management, although I'd argue that the last one is actually change. So have you got a change plan written down and costed? That doesn't mean necessarily a separate plan. It could be integrated into your project management plan and your project schedule. To do that, you need to have identified what the change activities were. You need to have an active sponsor in place, so someone that's sponsoring not just the technical changes that you're looking to put in place, but also the people behavioural changes. The change team understand their role. They may not be called a change team, and that's absolutely fine. They don't need to be. But if you've got a team who are implementing a transformation, they need to just understand that part of their role is to make that change stick within the organisation. And then having a communications plan created. So, which you would hope in most projects you'd have a communications plan, but this is thinking about how do you engage with your communications plan rather than just being information. So just a second poll for you again then. So if we were to answer this question around communications, because this is one of the ones that we often talk to clients about. So if you had that statement, a communications plan has been created that uses appropriate channels to reach those involved with and affected by the change. So if you can consider lean project work in your organisation or wider projects that you've been working on or projects that you work on within the organisation, for that statement, would you say that you agree with it? Yes, fully agree, in part, or no, nothing in place? And I'm hoping by talking that I gave Stuart time to type it in.
Perfect. We're heading, okay, so we've still got a few more to come in. The answers are heavily weighted to in part, Sally.
Yeah, which is what you would anticipate. And I think the thing with communication plans is that often what we do is we decide, oh, we're going to do a newsletter, or oh, I think we ought to do a weekly brief. And what, from a change perspective, you need to think about is that you've identified all the different channels that people will actually be communicated through. One organisation I work with said, well, we'll put it all up on the intranet. No one read the intranet. So as a communication channel, it wasn't actually an effective communication channel. So thinking about who your audience is, thinking about the channels that are available to you, and then making certain that you align the plan with the different phases in the implementation so that you get the right messages out there. And the other thing I'd say about communications is it's two-way. So it's not just about telling people stuff. It's about also enabling them to give their views and you addressing some of those concerns. So in part would be what you would typically expect. So that's good to hear. Bit of a shame it wasn't yes, but anyway, that's fine. So the next one is outcomes. So we're now in the other stuff. And for me, this is absolutely essential, although I might be saying this 5 times, but it's absolutely essential. What are the desired outcomes that you want from this change? And I'll use an example of if you're implementing a new process, is the desired outcome that you want a new process written down? Is the desired outcome that you want people to have been trained in the new process? Or is the desired outcome that the new process is just how people do stuff? Because if it's the last one, then you actually think about the activities that you put in place differently to the I've written a process and now I will tell people about it and hope they start following it. So it's just thinking about what your outcomes are that you want to achieve from the change. I was working with an engineering company, and the guy that was looking after all the IT software for the engineers said that just by thinking about it differently, it completely transformed the way he thought about his projects. Because typically he'd go out and he would research what software they needed, he'd buy the software and he'd make the licenses available. But he didn't get great uptake for that. So it's just about shifting, well, where do we want to get to? So the sorts of examples, the 5 statements for outcomes is, have you got clear outcomes defined? Have you got the deliverables? Because you will need deliverables to step towards those outcomes, but are they different? Have you got a shared understanding and language across all those involved to make certain that everyone's striving for the same end result? If you're driving towards outcomes, then actually you need to review your plan on a regular basis. Because sometimes what happens is that the plan needs to shift because actually the activities that you've put in place aren't delivering the outcomes. And that's quite common when people are involved, and maybe you need to do more consultation than you originally thought. And then also having some change management milestones in the plan is important. So that's outcomes.
Power, control.
The next one is around tenacity, which is this unwavering pursuit of the desired outcomes. Is everything okay, Stuart?
Yeah, sorted. Just getting a new call ready. Sorry.
That's all right. So whether you're implementing a small incremental change or a large, wide-reaching transformational change, you need to have tenacity. And I'm sure you can all recognise this. People often hope that you'll go away if you're doing a change that isn't very popular. Changes can take longer than anticipated. Sometimes the sponsor will come up with their next bright and shiny project before the project that you're working on is finished, so their attention can be diverted. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to continue being tenacious when others are less interested in the project because something else has taken their attention. So having tenacity is really is a really key part. So what does that mean? It means keep your key stakeholders involved. So helping the sponsor to maintain their focus. That might mean about having conversations with them, making certain they're regularly updated, making sure the necessary resources are made available. Again, sometimes people can start pulling resources away from changes because something else has taken priority. Making certain that your change team members are resilient, and by that I mean maybe coaching and supporting them when times are getting a bit difficult. So, and then resolving to overcome the issues that you've got. So making certain that you will overcome those issues and keep driving the thing forward. So sounds like Stuart's already got the poll up and running. So same thoughts. So for your change team experts or your lean practitioners, are they resilient and do they recover from setbacks always in pursuit of the desired outcomes? So again, same 3 questions, fully agree, in part, no, nothing in place. So where would you rate your projects for that one, please?
plenty of answers coming in, a few people changing their thoughts.
Oh, okay.
Give it a couple more seconds. People still making their decision. So far, very much weighted towards in part B.
Okay, would the next score be yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, which is sort of what I would expect given the audience that we're talking to, because I think as lean practitioners, you are making certain and driving forward with the changes that you're doing. Some other clients, actually, it tends to be a little bit more on the no side, because they're thinking more around putting people that maybe haven't got any experience of transformational change into these situations. But one of the brilliant things about doing this with the cards, or if you were to do it with the statements, is if each person decides what they think, so their own perspective, you can then have a conversation to see whether an individual's perspective matches the rest of the team. And sometimes what you find is that senior managers will think, yes, everything's marvelous, and actually the team themselves might think, well, we're not quite as robust as we could be. So it enables you to have some of those conversations as well. So I wouldn't say third, but the fourth one is human. And this is about showing compassion and empathy for individuals and their perspective in the wider context of the change. So it doesn't mean that you're not going to implement the change. It just means it's about how you go about talking with people, working with people. So how you approach the change, recognizing that people all bring with them their own emotions and history. Ideally, you'd look to work collaboratively to develop the end solution, because that's a brilliant way of taking that human approach. It's not always practical and it's not always possible, but it is a good way of being human in how you do that. And skepticism can be healthy, although sometimes it is worn as a badge of honour. And this is where the change curve that I talked about last time, this is where you would think about how do you transition people along the change curve, or teams along that change curve. So human is quite an important part again. So it's about, are you demonstrating an empathetic approach? Are you valuing people's perceptions and differences? Different people will bring their own views, and I think it's really important for people to feel that they've been listened to. That doesn't mean they'll like the answer, but at least they know you've listened to them and given them an answer that's grounded in that. So which it picks up on this actively listening. So new ideas are welcomed. If you can bring in some ideas from people that you're working with for the transformation, then they'll take more ownership from it. So whether those ideas are quite small or whether they're quite large, if you can integrate them, then it's a brilliant way of building ownership. And we talked about this, solutions being developed collaboratively. Then we're on to engagement. So whereas the last one was about how you approach it from a human perspective, this is about harnessing the emotional commitment from people to achieve the desired outcomes. So it's all about winning hearts and minds, or at least gaining acceptance. And again, if we think about the change curve for this one, not everyone will like the change, but they can accept the change at the end. So this is thinking around, so impacted individuals understanding their role. So if their role changes, it's really important that they understand what their new role is. We'll come on to that a little bit with reinforcement, but it's also a way of reinforcing what they're doing, but engaging them at this point. The stakeholders are actively managed. So we said we know who the stakeholders are, but for engagement, we need to think about how do we manage those, who needs to manage the different relationships. Communications, which goes back to our communications plan, are frequent and engaging. So they're not just telling people, they are engaging with people, thinking about the what's in it for me. So different audiences will have different what's in it for me. So if you're working with senior managers, you would know this. You need to put your language maybe from a business benefits perspective, and when you're working with the operatives or the guys doing the work, and actually thinking about, well, how is it going to improve their day-to-day working is really important. And then if at all possible, getting representatives from all the impacted areas involved in what you're doing. And then the last one is around reinforcement. So reinforcement is about supporting the desired benefits and practices to sustain the change right from the start. And I really like the analogy of the reinforcing steels, because you don't build a road bridge and then introduce the reinforcing steels at the end of the construction. You don't do it as an afterthought. I may be a little bit behind the times, and I'm sure there's some more modern technology that you use to reinforce road bridges, but it's about the premise that you need to put in reinforcement from the outset. You need to design it in. So, and then understanding and working with the culture, which we mentioned earlier. So when you're looking to work with some organisations find the introduction of post-its a very wacky thing to do, and other organisations are much more open. So thinking about how you're going to address some of that reinforcement, building up on the culture that you know about, and then thinking about how do you transition this to business as usual. So reinforcement is really important, and there are a number of ways you can reinforce cultural or transformational changes. So the 5 statements for reinforcement are you've taken into account the company culture. We need to think about baselines. So how are we going to measure whether we've made the changes that we want? This is one of the things that often with change programs is missed out, because the measures are difficult to capture. They're difficult to capture at the end, and they're certainly difficult to capture at the beginning. We build reinforcement into what we're doing. So that can be things like role definitions, organisational structure, looking at the working environment and changing the physical working environment. We exploit quick wins so that people realise that the change is happening. So if you can have those small quick wins going through, then people are more likely to accept that the change is happening. And then this last one, which is transition to business as usual, and planning in how you're going to do that. Is the sponsor going to change? How do we make certain that it transitions successfully from a transformation project into the normal ways of doing things? I may need to change that acronym actually, because I'm not certain business as usual will exist in the future. But anyway, so the last poll is if we think about lean project work in your organisation, how much is reinforcement built into the improvement plans from the beginning to support the outcomes? So again, same questions. Yes, fully agree. In part, no, nothing in place.
Polls on screen.
Excellent.
Last few people voting now. It's very close on 2 of the answers.
Okay.
A couple of people changing their mind now. A few more seconds for those who've not made a response yet. Okay, so in part, as basically 17 people have voted for in part, 10 people for no and nothing in place. And then we've got so in part's taking it.
Okay, and again, you know, I would sort of expect that, but I think this is an area that lots of people either get to the end and think, oh, how am I going to reinforce it, or don't actually think about it at all. So a bit like making certain that you've got outcomes at the beginning, ensuring that you've really thought through how we're going to reinforce this. So going back to the change curve, so people can't slip back down the change curve, and we get the outcomes that we require is really important. So again, just things for us to all think about. So the next slide talks about, hopefully you can all see this and it's not too small on your screens, but looking at tools and models that you can use, but tailoring them for your solution, for your situation. I think you have to be really pragmatic about which tools you use. There are a list down the side, so we use post-it planning to get a visual plan that engages with people other than just the change team. You can use Cotter's 8-step model, thinking about sponsorship in thought, word and deed, making certain you've got a communication strategy, making certain that you think about how you're going to deliver that communication strategy, stand-ups, which may be called morning prayers. So there's a tool called the HANDS model, which I can share with people if they're interested, which is about helping us to scope what the change is. And then lots of other things going through there. We also sometimes use psychometrics to look at the team dynamics, to see how the individuals and what help they might need. Having people to facilitate those sessions. Thinking about the cultural web, again, another tool that you can use to define the culture, because if you understand the culture, you can understand maybe some of the changes that you want to make. And then using visual measures, which as lean practitioners, you'll be more than familiar with. And you can see how that suite of tools can be used across those 6 different areas. So definitely think about your change activities, put them in the plan from the beginning, plan your communications, make certain that you've got capacity. Communications take time and effort, so you need to think about who's going to do the communications, have we got the time to write them. Talking about measuring from the outset, both the tangible and the intangible. And then again, research shows that successful change projects that spend between 10 and 15% of their budget on change type activities. So a lot of which would be communications, engagement, stakeholder management, but making certain that the change aspects are put in place. And I think often when projects are designed, actually the change is sort of thought about as secondary. So making certain that you've thought about some of those things and building them into your plan is really important. And then I thought, again, it's the same example as I used last time, but quite a different take on it, it would be worth just saying for area 10 what we did for those 5 different areas. An outcomes perspective, and actually we came up with the road to reliability, we called the project, and we had 6 different areas. So we had cost, delivery, sustainability, quality, health and safety, and enablers. And we had 2 or 3 outcomes for each one of those. For under delivery, we had 100% milestone adherence for the schemes. Under sustainability, we had excellent customer and stakeholder collaborative relationships, so BS 11,000. Under enablers, we had an appropriate lean culture across area 10, so embedded for continuous improvement. So we had a number of outcomes that we then designed the plan to deliver. So from a Tenacity perspective, the project had an external person, myself, involved, which I think can help make it a reality in the early days. And it also remained, so road to reliability remained the main vehicle for improvement since its inception. So any improvement projects were put through the same vehicle. So it gave it life, which meant that the tenacity was there because you had that sort of momentum sitting behind it. On the human side, we asked for people's views, we listened to their concerns, we coached some of the line managers and team leaders to work their way through it. So it was very much about listening to people and hearing their views. From an engagement perspective, we had Highways England buy-in and sponsorship in the early days, which was brilliant. We ran workshops to design the solution, so we engaged with people within the teams. We ran a launch event, we did IPT training, we put in place a communications plan, which was repeated over a period of time. And then for reinforcement, we relayed out the office space. So we moved everyone out of the functions and into these integrated project teams. Much harder for people to slip back if they're not working in the same area. We changed the organisational structure and the role definitions, and there was continued reinforcement by the SLT over the coming months and years. So a number of things that we did for each of those different areas, but if you think about them, that you can do on some of your projects. So in summary, believe in the importance of the soft stuff. If I had £1 for every time people say you do the pink and fluffy stuff, I would be quite wealthy, but actually the pink and fluffy stuff is quite hard to do, which is why quite often we avoid it. Bother with change. Don't do change management by hope. Well, hopefully people will see this as a good thing to do, and hopefully they'll start working differently. So what we need to do is we need to plan for success. Think about the cultures that you're working in and what works, and know there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and you can not be one of the statistics. You can make things work differently. And then what I thought would be really useful is thinking about the 6 areas. How can you relate them to what you already know, adapt them for your own purposes? So I'd like you to just take a minute to write down 3 keywords or 3 phrases that describe your key takeaways from this session. And if we get enough coming through once you've written them down on the comments, what I'll do is consolidate them, because I think it'd be really interesting to see what the learning is or what the reflection is. I'm assuming, Stuart, that we can sort of cut and paste the things from the comments.
Yeah, I can't cut and paste them onto the actual screen for people to see.
No, but I can do something, so I can create an additional slide afterwards.
Yeah, we might be able to.
Yeah.
Let me just try something.
Okay. I can't see what's happening, so I'm going to. Have you had any success, Stuart?
So we've got. You can have a reinforcement plan on paper, but actually the changes you need to enact it can be a change in themselves. The CEO must be seen to be on board.
Yeah.
Need a clear plan and resources. Engage at a personal level is vital. And user needs are key. Human element, trying to understand their why. Tenacity, good things come to those who wait.
Yes, that's very true.
Communication, reinforcement and engagement.
Okay.
Human, tenacity, clear plan. What's in it for me?
Okay. So there's a range of things there. I think what we'll do is if I can cut and paste those, I'll consolidate that into a list and share it as extra slide. So after the event. So thank you for sending those through. And that was all I wanted to say really about why would we bother about change. Obviously, if you want to find out a little bit more about the statements that we've got, then get in touch. But meanwhile, I'll hand back to Stuart as master of ceremonies and see if there's any questions you want to ask.
So if anybody's got any questions they want to ask, we've got a couple of questions in the text, which I'll just scroll back to. How little success does it take for a failure?
So, say that I missed. You went quiet. How little success does it take for what?
A project to become a failure. So I know we often set our sights on what we see then as a success, even though when we succeed in something, it might not reach the level we thought it would, but it's still seen as being a failure, even though it's a better situation than we were before. So how little success does it take for a project to become a failure?
So I would say, so if we think about introducing new technology, so maybe if no one uses that new technology and you've invested time and energy in purchasing new equipment and it just sits on the shelf, then I would say that was a failure. So so the same with processes. Processes, and it's different for different companies. Some companies I work with, people think process is optional. So they realise that it's there on the R drive or wherever it sits, but they think it's optional. Some companies, if you change the process, they absolutely will adhere to it because they're very process driven as organisations. So again, if you write a process and it just sits on the shelf or sits in the virtual drive and it's not actually followed, then I would say that it's been a failure. So it's about, for me, it's about, has it delivered the end outcomes that you're looking for? Because if it doesn't deliver those outcomes, then actually it's not been successful. And that's why getting the outcomes right is so important. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does, yeah. So I've got a question for you, Sally.
Yeah.
The table that you showed with the different techniques for
Yes.
the different types of areas that you could use them, are any of those techniques kind of beginners techniques or more advanced techniques? How do you have a way of actually categorizing them? So some that are easier to use and implement and some are more experienced or require a lot more input?
I would say that I could tell you the ones that I think are more difficult to implement. So the cultural web is is more, probably more advanced. So because you need to be able to go into that organisation and extract some quite nebulous information. The hands model requires a little bit of thought. That talks about the different levers that you need to apply to make a change happen. But I would say the majority of them, you know, Kotter's 8 steps, they're not difficult. If you know what they are, they're not difficult to do, and they just give you a checklist of how you would go through them. Post-it planning, if you know how to do it, is very straightforward. Again, if you're interested, I've got a couple of handouts on it that I could share with people. So I would say that most of those, Stuart, are relatively straightforward to apply. It's just thinking about them.
Okay.
And knowing, I suppose, knowing when to apply them.
Comment from Victoria said, failure of the project is often judged against your original goal, but not necessarily a failure in general terms. Failure is just success in progress. I like that. Does anyone else have any questions? If you do, I can make you a speed to Sally directly. If you put your hand up, I can. Speaker. Thanks, speaker. See you later.
Are you still there, Stuart, or have I lost you? Are you there? Oh,
I'm back
sorry,
again.
I lost you. Yes.
Yeah, I'm back again. My wonderful Wi-Fi. Victoria said, how many change projects have you led and how many were successful?
So I've led probably 10 significant change projects over my career, and they've all been successful, because I often start with the premise that I've not failed. However, I'm going to caveat that they've often overrun. So we did a big change program over in Northern Ireland, which should have taken 10 months and took 20 months. And that was mainly because the whole of the organisation, pretty much from the senior leadership team down, didn't think that the change was appropriate or necessary. And another change project, again, should have taken 6 months, took 12 months. I think the SLT project with Area 10 took slightly longer than we'd anticipated, because you've got to take the people with you. So you can use more of a hammer approach to change, but when you do that, you've still got to put the pieces in place. So in answer to Victoria's question, I've never failed. I've never failed to deliver the outcomes. I've failed to deliver them on time.
I know with the Area 10 one, there was over 300 people involved in the actual process, wasn't there?
Yes, yeah, and many of whom were very happy, thank you very much, with the way we're working at the moment. The fact that the customer was very unhappy about it was a bit of an aside for some of them.
Any questions from the people left on the call? If you want to, I can make you a speaker. So, comment from Brealey: the commitment is in pockets within a large client organisation, not top bottom, and across all disciplines. And individual projects with that commitment do succeed to achieve improved outcomes. And programs with several projects where the commitment is not present in some deliver little improvement, just more of the same.
Yeah, so the sorts of the tips and techniques that I would say, and you probably already know this, but if you haven't got influence over a stakeholder and they're not buying in, then look for somebody else in the organisation who has got that influence. So if I take Northern Ireland, I was a female and I didn't belong to the organisation and I was leading it. And for many of them, that was a very bad thing. So I had to use other people in the organisation and in my team that could have influence over different people. So I think don't be hesitant in thinking, well, how else can I influence those people? Because it may be that they won't hear your voice, but they'll listen to somebody else's. So, and it is very common to have the problems that you've talked about, but also if you can pick up some of the stories and some of the things that have happened and capture some of the good practices and capture some of those benefits, it's much harder for people to say, so you don't want to achieve these benefits for your business then. So it's just thinking about how you manipulate some of the language, but also thinking about how do you manage your stakeholders if they're not listening to you as an individual.
Okay. We've got a question from Jamie from Chevron. Comms plans. Have you found that you need to adapt them and change as you move along?
Yes, absolutely. I think the challenge with comms plans is that people often, people say, oh, we need a newsletter. It's like, well, why are you going to do a newsletter? Well, we can put our communications in it. Well, actually, if no one reads them, then they're not communications. And I think looking at what's working and what's not working, some organisations' communications are very effective, others are less effective. So you do need to keep addressing your comms plan and changing it to the circumstances. And as you transition through the change curve, not that you can see my hand transitioning, but as you transition through the change curve, you need to change the communications that you're going through. So as you're moving along it, you need to do more engagement, probably more training. Top tip, lots of people don't see training as an opportunity for communications. Why would you not at the beginning of your training session put in a short 10-15 minute extra session that says, what have you heard? Have you got any questions? So just thinking about every opportunity that you can to actually communicate with people. If there's existing communication channels, how can we hop on? How can I maybe get a slide attached to regular team briefs? But yeah, changing it as it goes through is really important. Working out when you can get a message to people and when actually it's not working.
Okay, any more questions from anybody? A couple more seconds. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'm gonna, well, first of all, I'm gonna thank Sally for another great presentation. Really enjoyed it, Sally, and as always, it's a pleasure to have you talk and present the session. Thanks to everybody who joined, and I hope you continue to join and support these sessions. If there's no more questions, I'm going to stop the recording. I will post Sally's slides, and if you've got some information you can share about the techniques, Sally, that would be great.
Okay.
And if anybody wishes to contact Sally, her details are on the slides that she presented and on the presentations I'll put into the SharePoint site. Recording now if there's no more questions. Last chance.